Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for coming over here. And this is really exciting. We have lots of people fill up this room. And before we start, I just want to mention one thing that we set up a lunch after this, but it's for those who signed up for the lunch. But if you really want to keep discussing it, please let me know. I'm a gatekeeper and I just need to manage the people for the lunch. I got scolded if I last. Oh my gosh. I got depressed. But let me introduce Dr. Asia Dowtin. And Asia joined MSU 6 years ago, 2018. She graduated from University of Delaware, focusing on the biogeochemistry and hydrology. And she has been a precious member of the Department of Forestry, focusing on the community and urban forest. And it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Aki, and thank you all for taking some time out of your Monday morning to learn a little bit more about the program I've worked to build over the past 6 years here at MSU. So we'll take about an hour to go through some of the things that I've been working on between research, teaching, and extension that have allowed us to kind of broaden our understanding on how we can optimize our approaches to sustainable urban forest management. So, little early, oh, let me see. Okay, so it's a little early to be thinking about the holidays, maybe not if you've been to Costco recently where they're already selling Christmas trees, but 'tis the season, right? Not just from the perspective of the holiday season, but also really from the perspective of a couple months ago, I went to lunch with Dr. Burt Craig, and he explained in the middle of the lunch that urban forestry is having a moment. And this is true, it is undeniable, and it's for several reasons that we're kind of having this unprecedented capstone moment in urban and community forestry. And so to understand where we are now as a field, I think it's kind of important for us to kind of take a couple steps back. So let's go all the way back about 100 years ago, when we started seeing maybe the early rumblings of scholarship and conversations around urban and community forestry here in the US. So from a research perspective, you can see that looking back 100 years, when it came to papers and research being published in the field, very much so at a near minimal to nothing really coming out. And as we progress through the 20th century, moving really into the latter half of the century, is when we began to, watching the notes, I'm gonna make sure I stay close. But you can see during the latter half of the 20th century is when we really started to see a slow uptake in research being done in urban and community forestry, and that continued through the latter half of the 20th century and transitioned right into the 2000s that we're deeply moving into with the exponential growth within the past 20 years or so. And so to that extent, we can see from a research perspective just how much work has been not just done, but the acceleration with which that work is being done. So that's kind of looking at things from a quantitative perspective. I think it's important to look at the evolution of research being done in the field over the past 100 years. And so about 90 or so years ago, conversation started pretty high level, trying to get folks to understand that in our communities, there is a need and a benefit to maintaining our urban community and urban and community forests. At that time, they were looking at them as a neglected resource to which folks should begin to maybe think about directing their attention. And then moving forward into the late 1960s, I'm just gonna try to get my pointer out. We could see that conversations started to go from high level to more region specific focus, looking at really how do we start adapting forestry methods in this growing megalopolis of the eastern seaboard of the United States. And now moving into a little bit closer to the present age, we can see that we've kind of moved even deeper into a little bit more of a scientific foundation for urban and community forestry, where we're looking at how do we quantify the impacts of urban and community forests on various aspects of human life, such as health and well-being. So that's one of the motivators. We've kind of seen the shift in focus in our research and how it's continued to evolve quantitatively, and then in terms of the topics that we're studying. A lot of that honestly has been due to the fact that beyond the research world, there's been different levels of impacts that have kind of without warning, forced us to think about how we manage our urban forests. Across the eastern US, mid-60s and onward, there was the onset of different pests and pathogens such as Dutch elm disease and the emerald ash borer that within a very short time span removed or led to the loss of significant canopy cover in cities across the US. Why? Because the dominant practice was to plant trees that looked good, oftentimes that would provide a uniform visual experience for folks living and engaging with our urban spaces. And so why not plant a whole bunch of elm trees or ash trees? They do well in cities, they look fabulous at different parts of the year. They're also really susceptible to these pests and pathogens when they come through. And so when there's a monoculture or leaning towards a monoculture in our cities, we ended up losing a significant amount of tree cover, which forced us to think about the realities of diversifying tree cover in our urban forests. So this has kind of pushed us forward to think more strategically about how we plan and plant out our urban forests. But beyond thinking about what species we're going to plant, what's really been a significant force in propelling the field forward has been the invention of open source software such as iTree, which has allowed us to really begin to quantify the ecosystem services that our urban forests are providing, both from a volume production perspective, if you will. In other words, how much air pollution are our trees removing? How much cooling do they provide to our cities? And most importantly, from a quantification and evaluation perspective, how much are they contributing to stormwater mitigation in and around our cities? And now within the past really 3 to 5 years, we've had this significant shift beyond just looking at the urban forest for the trees of it all, and now beginning to look at the people who live and work and play around these trees. And we've seen the introduction of new rules and new ways of thinking that are forcing us in a good way to think about how people interact with their urban forests. And so one of these new rules, if you will, is the 330-300 rule, recently introduced and widely adopted, introduced by Cecil Condendijk. And essentially with this rule, it's kind of created a culture shift in urban and community forestry where now we're starting to think, yes, these trees do good things. Yes, we want to make sure that we have a diversity of trees in our cities, but we want to also make sure that for the diverse folks that live in our cities, anybody, no matter where they live in the city or community, how much they make, what they look like, where they live again, they should be able to look out their window and see a minimum of 3 trees. And for whatever community they call them home, that community should have no less than 30% of all land area covered with trees. And for any person, again, no matter where they live in that community or where that community is on the globe, they should be within about 300 meters or walking distance to a local park where there is accessible and enjoyable urban green space. And last but not least, here on the home turf in the US, we've had this unprecedented shift in urban forestry that's been sort of made possible by way of this influx of $1.5 billion into the federal urban and community forestry budget. This is huge. It's a huge number. I think if any of us got $1.5 billion, we'd probably not be coming to work anymore. But in urban forestry, it's actually given us the opportunity to actually get to work. And prior to this influx of money, again, by way of the Inflation Reduction Act, the national budget for urban forestry was stuck at about $36 million. Sounds like a lot, but when you have to distribute that among 50 states and additional territories, it doesn't go far. With this $1.5 billion influx, we now have capacity to do work that's really been the content of dreams in the urban and community forestry world. Here in Michigan, our budget significantly increased up to $7.5 million, which has allowed for an increase in staff. And it'll be really interesting to see how we can advance this field here in the state in just the coming years. So between the research that's been done, the way that we've gotten this funding, our new shift to thinking about not just the trees, but the people, there's this unifying message that's bringing us all together in urban forestry. And honestly, that's set the foundation for the work that I've been doing here at MSU for the past 6 years. And that message is that urban forests must be biologically diverse. They need to be managed well so that the trees actually live long enough to provide benefits. And they need to be fully accessible to any and all who may live in or engage with the city. That accessibility makes them or puts them in a position to be of maximum benefit to, again, any and all the folks who engage with these urban green spaces. And so taking this as the unifying message that's really shaping where we're moving as a field, I've kind of also been thinking about these principles and these occurrences and this research to develop my program here at MSU. For my program, there are 3 specific or distinct pillars that really guide my work, and again, is grounded in that unifying ideology in urban forestry. So pillar 1 is really focused on optimizing ecosystem service provision by our urban tree cover. Pillar 2 is focused on increasing capacity for sustainable urban forest management. And that third pillar is tied to strengthening pathways to urban forestry through strategic and inclusive workforce development and development of educational materials for folks who live and work and play, again, in our cities. We're going to take some time to dive into each of these pillars, but I'd be remiss without stating first that all the work that I've been able to do here has been possible through the PERM agreement. So I serve as a PERM faculty here at MSU. PERM stands for the Partnership for Ecosystem Research and Management, and it's a partnership between MSU's College of Ag and Natural Resources and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And collectively, the two entities work together to find where there's need for research to inform action at the state level. They've done so in creating an urban and community forestry faculty position, which I serve in. And as a result, I work closely with the DNR to identify where there's need to amplify how we practice urban forestry by way of research. And so a lot of the work that you'll see me talk about today is really informed by and really guided by some of the needs that have also been identified at the state level. So let's talk about pillar 1, optimizing ecosystem services by urban tree cover. Big statement. The way that I think about it in my program is really kind of motivated by this one driving question, which is, how does the variability that we may see in different physical traits of trees actually impact their ability to provide regulating ecosystem services? Looking specifically at stormwater mitigation and really thinking about how can we continue to build up a really strong, really rich, really informative database that little by little tells us how individual tree species behave, especially when it comes to interacting with water. And then how can we use that information to think about, if we want to plant trees in our cities and we know we need to diversify our urban tree cover, can we be really strategic in planting trees that we know are going to help us meet that goal and do so at an optimal level? So all that being said, the way that I shape those initiatives or my research initiatives tied to that question, that big driving question, is with this baseline understanding of what happens when it rains on an urban forest or an urban tree. And so there are lots of things that can happen. We don't have all day, so we can't talk about all of them, but I would invite you to think about the fact that there's things that can happen above ground, and then there's things and processes that can happen below ground. And we're gonna focus the conversation today around what can happen to a raindrop that falls on an urban tree above the ground. And so above ground, there are 3 potential fates that we tend to focus on. And those are interception, which is essentially that precipitation that is captured by leaves and branches and likely evaporated back into the atmosphere. When we think about interception, we can think about that precipitation that never makes it to the ground or like very minimally makes it to the ground. And from a stormwater perspective, that's water that we don't have to manage, water that we don't have to think about contributing to localized flooding. So that's right at the canopy level. Below the canopy, though, there are things that can also happen to precipitation, one of which is throughfall, one of the big categories of sub-canopy water flux that we talk about. And throughfall essentially explains that precipitation that may pass through the canopy by way of gaps, or it may be precipitation that may fall on a leaf or a branch and subsequently falls to the ground by way of mechanical displacement. And then that second below canopy fate is stem flow, which is the precipitation that falls to the base of a tree by way of being transported along that tree's main stem. So both from a volume perspective and a chemistry perspective, looking at throughfall and stem flow are extremely important about understanding the transport and fate of water through our urban forest ecosystems. When it comes to actually collecting those, we use a series of field-based methods. In the photos that are shown, those milk jugs with the funnels on top, we use those to collect our throughfall. You can place it below the canopy of any individual tree or scattered throughout any particular woodlot you may be investigating in. And then the trash cans with the tube attached are part of our fabulous stem flow collection systems, where essentially you attach a stem flow collar to the trunk of a tree about at breast height, and then allow the water that falls down your trunk to be caught in that collar and subsequently drained to your stem flow collector. For both throughfall and stem flow, the data that you get out in the field can then be brought into your lab or the safety of wherever you work on your computer to then back calculate the metric of interception. So if we have volumetric data on throughfall and stem flow and whatever precipitation fell out in the open where there were no trees, we can then back calculate interception. And collectively, we can use that information to understand what percent of rainfall in any given storm fell below the canopy and which didn't. And for that precipitation that did not fall below the canopy, we can then attribute that to the trees contributing to stormwater mitigation in our local area. So background moderately established, we can now switch gears and talk about some of the work that I've done in this. I'm gonna start off talking or sharing with you all some cool things that my colleagues and I found through a meta-analysis that we did, looking at all of the physical traits that do govern throughfall, stem flow, and interception in and around our cities, or by way of trees in and around our cities. This was published last year in Landscape and Urban Planning. I'll talk briefly about the traits that promote rainfall capture or interception by the canopy. By way of a deep dive into the literature, we found 3 key physical traits that are tied with like maximizing your rainfall interception in your cities or by your urban trees. Number 1 being a high crown projection area, 2 being high canopy density. And I'll pause right there to say that between the two, the connection between their presence, if you will, in an urban tree, more largely in an urban forest, and stormwater mitigation is that between the two, you are increasing the surface area for your individual tree. And that increased surface area allows for increased spaces, if you will, upon which precipitation can be intercepted and eventually evaporated back into the atmosphere, thereby, again, not necessarily making it to the surface and not needing to be managed as stormwater. And then at a more fine scale level, we looked also and found that there's strong correlations between your leaf surface roughness and the ability of that leaf to retain precipitation. And so the higher the roughness on the adaxial side of your leaf, the higher the potential that leaf has or displays for not only capturing precipitation, but holding on to it once it's captured. On the contrary, there are traits that promote drainage, and this is just as important to know, again, if you want to select specific trees to help you meet your stormwater management goals. So a lot of these are the counter of what we looked at on the other side, and so likely very intuitive, but tree traits that promote drainage and therefore that passage of precipitation down to the surface include downward sloping branches, low canopy density, which can result not just from looking at things from an individual species level, but also from managerial practices in our cities. So how often we prune can impact the density of our canopy. And then looking at things at that leaf level, again, complete opposite. When you have leaves that have a lower surface roughness, they tend to be more hydrophobic, and as a result will more quickly or more efficiently release precipitation that falls on them to levels below the canopy. We looked beyond the canopy looked into the literature to see beyond the canopy what other physical traits of trees also impact that subcanopy flux of water. And we found that the bark on our trunk does play a significant role. And some of these relationships, again, should make sense, right? The more rough the bark is, the more likely precipitation is to be caught up in it. That roughness can be attributed to various factors, including the bark morphology, including the alignment of furrows on your bark. And contrarily, the more smooth your bark is, the more efficiently precipitation can be transported down to the base. And thinking about things quantitatively or volumetrically, what this looks like is for our more rough bark trees, our stem flow totals tend to be lower. So that's kind of indicated by the narrowness of the arrows here. And for our more smooth bark trees, our stem flow values tend to be higher. So thinking about this from a big picture, how do we bring this all together? Why does this make sense, or why should anybody care about this level? We're trying to optimize ecosystem service provision. We want to make this information available to people who don't sit in the ivory tower every day, but are on the ground making decisions around which trees to plant. If you can understand, or if you know that the trees that you're planning to plant will display or will have a certain bark morphology or bark characteristics or canopy characteristics, you can make more strategic decisions around what you're going to plant if you need to help manage your stormwater bodies or your stormwater volumes in your city. So we wrapped that publication, which was made open source specifically so that urban resource managers could have access to this information, by really outlining what are the characteristics that are going to put us in the direction of picking the trees that are going to do the service that we want them to perform. This was kind of a surprise to me, but after publishing this, I had gotten a phone call from a colleague out in Snoqualmie, Washington, who actually read the paper, which is always a shock. But they actually read the paper and wanted to use this as their guide for their tree selection process over the next few years. So we'll see in time if that's implemented, but it is encouraging to know that beyond, again, where we sit in the ivory tower, like this information is not only getting out, but is also being found to be useful by urban foresters who are in the land on a daily basis. So I mentioned earlier that urban trees and all this sub-canopy flux of water, there's a volumetric piece of the equation. There's also a hydrochemical piece of the equation. And I want to just reiterate that what we were doing all along was trying to figure out how do different tree species contribute to this conversation. You want to look at that when it comes to sub-canopy water flux. You also want to look at that when it comes to sub-canopy nutrient flux. And in a project completed by Luis Rivera Cabero, one of my former PhD students who successfully graduated last year, we looked at that. We did a study right here in East Lansing where we looked at the impact of different tree species on sub-canopy nutrient flux, looking specifically at different nitrogen species. And we found that there are, when you're looking at both the concentration of nitrate in a sample and the flux of nitrate, so concentration tells us, hey, what's there just in general, and flux tells us what's being transported. We were able to find that between our basswood species present or places where we had through fall collectors put out where basswood tended to be more dominant, you could see a difference in through fall nitrate concentrations and fluxes relative to where our through fall collectors were put out and red oak was present. There was also an influence of sugar maple on our ammonium concentrations. So again, big picture here, we're trying to move towards optimizing urban tree selection. We do that by gaining more and more data on how individual tree species are behaving and how they're contributing to the transport of water and also that chemical modification of precipitation. And it's been really fun over the past couple of years to answer that question for more and more species of trees. So that's been where the project, or not the project, but where my focus really started when I came to MSU. But like I shared, I work as a perm faculty, and as a perm faculty, I have to move in flux with the needs of community partners around the state. And that's led to a shift, or maybe an expansion, if you will, is a better way to put it, of the focus of this question or this pillar in my lab. And so over the past year and a half, we've also began to do work where we're looking at not just the physical tree traits that impact sub-canopy water flux, but now beginning to look at the physiological traits that impact how well urban trees can provide additional ecosystem services, such as remediating contaminants from the soil. Now, we talked about there's two things that can happen to that precipitation that hits the tree, things above ground and below ground. We're now kind of, cheesy pun intended, deepening our roots to look at what's happening and how the root systems in our trees are taking up water. And then again, tying things back into our rainfall partitioning. How are these trees impacting, how does tree species impact water flux above the ground? And so this is all tied into a project that some community partners in Detroit started 10 years back. It was a project where they got significant funding through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to plant trees on brownfield sites across the city. They planted specific willow and poplar genotypes that are known to be effective at remediating contaminants from the soil without taking much of a risk, if you will, or a hit to their ability to continue to grow and function in those rougher soil environments. And so they started the work. We're coming in about a decade later to answer the question, how effective were those different willow and poplar genotypes? And utilizing whatever data we get from that question, how can we then plant those types of genotypes that perform the best in the city in different brownfield sites that also need to be remediated? So The partner that we worked with was the Greening of Detroit. They planted out 8 different sites across the city. Our team this year has really focused on looking at the impacts of, how well those trees have grown at 2 specific sites. One of those is Ferry Park, which is on the left side of the screen, and you can see kind of like a time lapse of what happened when the cuttings from our willows and poplars were planted in 2014, how quickly they grew in about a year later, and how mature the site is today. And you can see the same at Leonard, which is, I'll just say, Ferry Park, for those familiar with Detroit, it's just down the street from the Motown Museum. And then Leonard it's in the southwest section of the city, just a stone's throw from all of the refineries. So comfortably nestled in Michigan's most polluted zip code. So I will not go into much detail around everything. Again, that's a whole nother conversation and study, but happy to talk about it at lunch. What I did want to do for you today is just show you, again, our main question here is how well do different genotypes actually help to remediate the soil? You can't answer that question without knowing what's in the soil. And so we were able to look at what was in the soil. Again, our colleagues had the data, we processed it this summer, but looked at which contaminants were in the soil at the time of planting. And we found that 8 out of 10 Michigan 10 heavy metals, I should say, were present in our sites. And then you could see, just looking at arsenic and lead between Ferry Park and Leonard, where we had multiple plots set up, just how far above the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services levels of arsenic, or like the baseline or healthy level, how far above the observations actually are at those different sites. So we're going back in this year to actually take tissue samples and look at what was actually taken up. Right now we have that baseline understanding. We also looked at, from year to year, which genotypes actually survived. And again, a lot of data here. What I want to really point out here is that for our different genotypes, we had different percentages of survival. Again, just kind of heightening our awareness of the fact that these trees are there, they're providing an overall service, but there are differences, genotype to genotype, and then genus to genus, as we're looking at, again, willow and poplar. And last but not least, again, a lot of stuff here, but I just want to keep it high level for the sake of time today. We also wanted to look at, between the different sites and the different genotypes that we had in our study, how did our growth rates change? And you could see between Leonard and Ferry Park, how our height differences were between our different genotypes, and then the differences in caliper growth in the short time span that we had to look at that data. So we're honestly in the early stages of this process, but this is something that I'm looking forward to building over the next few years. And we'll be able to do so by way of a significant grant provided to our team by way of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And really looking forward to advancing this study with my collaborators from the Forest Service, the Greening of Detroit, and Rescue My Nature Now. And I'll just keep bringing back in the concept that none of this is really possible without the community partners. We're helping to tie up a study that the Greening started a long time ago, but in jumping into this work, we've actually been able to bring on new community partners who want the data to figure out how can we plant trees and then plant them across Detroit to really solve similar issues in our neighborhood. And so to that point, we've been working with our community partners to actually establish nurseries across the city. I'm highlighting here our stool bed nursery, which has been really cool how different parts of the MSU community have come together to make this happen. Last year, we worked with students from the Detroit MAID program to actually break ground on the stool bed, which was established this year. And we had something like 700 cuttings that we planted that have grown up significantly. So you can see where we planted them about a month out. I think this is late June, early July. And then just a couple weeks later, just how much growth we've had at that one site. And if you were to go out with me today to see the site, we have some of our cuttings that started about this big that are now more than 7 feet in growth. And so we're going to be, again, utilizing this material to plant out in subsequent growing seasons for the sake of meeting these distinct ecosystem service needs in the city. Okay, so that's pillar 1, optimizing ecosystem service provision by way of understanding how different trees perform in our city. Pillar two is kind of taking it from the data for the individual tree level and now thinking about things from that bigger picture of urban forest management. How do we take this information and fold it into our urban forest management plans, goals, what have you? And what I've been working with the DNR and community partners, and really even from a research perspective and understanding is where are we as a state baseline level with our urban forest management strategies? And how do we take that information to now step our game up, especially now that we have all this extra money to do so? So what I've been doing now is really looking at the building blocks of urban forest management and thinking through and analyzing how communities, if they even are doing so, but how are they possibly utilizing these building blocks and folding it into their management plans. So just for background, for the sake of background information, I want you all to know that in the world of urban forestry, we've got 3 key building blocks that we think about when it comes to managing an urban forest. And I'll just backtrack for half a second and say that when it comes to managing an urban forest, just like when it comes to planning a vacation or trying to, take down your debt, everything starts with a solid plan. And the better your plan is, the better you are at actually achieving whatever the goal is. And so to manage an urban forest very well, you need to have a strong urban forest management plan. A strong urban forest management plan is really built on 3 foundational building blocks, which are kind of guided by these 3 foundational questions. So question 1 is, what do we have? Which is essentially kind of getting us to think about what do we have in terms of the trees that are in our city? And then what do we have in terms of the resources to manage these trees, whether it's people or equipment or what have you? Once we understand what we actually have, then we get to kind of freely think about what do we actually want? Do we want to increase our tree cover? Do we actually want to optimize our tree selection so that we can hit different ecosystem service goals? And then that third building block that allows us to build on those first 2 questions is the practical side of it. How do we get what we want? And that really is when you start putting the nuts and bolts together to say, okay, we have 10% tree cover. This 3300 rule says that we need 30% tree cover. This is where we got to start moving to either acquire our plant material or the neighborhoods we need to plant in, or yada, yada, yada. So these building blocks in mind, what I've been working on over the past few years is some research questions that really kind of focus on that first building block of what do we have, and really starting to build up an understanding of how well do our municipalities here in Michigan assess what they have in their urban forest. So there's been 3 key questions that have kind of guided the work in this area. And again, things that we looked at for the past 15 minutes were more field-based empirical research. This is a little bit more document analysis and really looking at urban forest management plans that are here in Michigan. And so to that end, we've been looking at what proportion of Michigan municipalities even have an up-to-date urban forest management plan. For the ones that do, how comprehensive are they? Do they actually provide a legitimate roadmap to help communities understand this is what we have and this is where we're trying to get and this is how we're going to do it? And all that considered, what standards, if any, are actually used to report out on the goals, the baseline data and then the goals within our urban forest management plan? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about that first part of the baseline data, what communities actually have those plans and how do they report their baseline data. So to that end, my team and I, for years now, have been trying to get our hands on every single urban forest management plan that we can for the state of Michigan. And despite the vastness of our state, the 9 hours from Detroit to Marquette or some far point west in the UP, we could only find 55 urban forest management plans. Or honestly, documents that kind of look like plans. Based on our criteria, only 37 actually were classified as plans. And just really quickly on that front, we needed something that talked about the entire urban forest within a municipality, not just the downtown district, which is what we saw in a lot of the plans. And we took those plans and we did a deep dive by way of content analysis. We looked at a few things in that content analysis. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is that first assessment of how well do these plans assess what they actually have. In other words, how well are they keeping record of their urban tree inventory? So to do this, I developed a metric called the Tree Diversity Reporting Index, which is essentially a way to kind of give these plans a grade on how well they're accounting for their urban forest diversity. The Tree Diversity Reporting Index is essentially a sum of 7 key biodiversity metrics that tend to be reported in urban forest management plans. For any municipality to receive a perfect score in the TDRI, they have to report out on all 7 of those metrics. And for them to get a failing score, they don't report out on any. So we applied the TDRI in a paper that's now in review right now with the Journal of Environmental Management to those 37 plans that we found in Michigan. And again, ultimately what we were looking at here is a comprehensiveness assessment, if you will. How comprehensively is urban forest urban forest diversity reported in these plans? The way we thought about this is if a municipality received a score of 4 or higher, then they're doing decently, if you will, with reporting out their biodiversity metrics. And we found that in the great state of Michigan, we're doing pretty well by and large, right? So majority of our communities had a TDRI score of 4 or higher. About 67% of our urban forest management plans kind of passed the comprehensiveness check according to that criteria. And we found that most commonly when they are reporting biodiversity metrics, they're reporting out on species condition, species composition, condition rating, the size class distribution of our trees, and then less frequently on how the condition of trees will change based on the size classes that they may constitute. We also looked at, again, that question about like, are there any standards with respect to how biodiversity is being reported? And the answer is absolutely not. It's kind of Wild West, hot mess situation going on with all different types of terminology being used to report out on different metrics such as condition rating, and very little, oftentimes no explanation as to what is meant by these assignments to condition rating classes, which may not seem like a big deal, but you will find yourself quickly understanding that a good tree in Dexter could be completely different than a good tree in Flint, which could be completely different than a good tree in Escanaba without a baseline, shared, well-explained explanation of what the heck we're actually talking about. And so, from this work, we are now moving in the direction of creating guidance around baseline requirements for how to report urban forest diversity metrics in our urban forest management plans. Again, it seems small, but with the influx of $1.5 billion and all of this push towards a more universally accessible urban forest, it's just as important to make sure that information about our urban forest is both universally accessible and universally understood. And I'm looking forward to continuing that effort, not just here in Michigan, but also at a national scale by way of a newly awarded grant by way of the Forest Service that's going to allow for this national scale assessment of a comprehensiveness of reporting out of these metrics in urban forest management plans across the US, but then also now taking it to the personal level, with this grant also supporting work of really working with our urban forest managers across the country to understand how competently they feel about their ability to carry out what's laid out in their urban forest management plans, high level, and then specific to ecosystem services that they want to see achieved in their urban forest over the next few years. So looking forward to diving into that work, and really excited about the opportunity to take these same questions abroad by way of a grant awarded through MSU's Alliance for African Partnership. And this grant is going to allow for these same questions to now be explored in Kenya and Cameroon. It feels unbelievable. It's really exciting. Going in just a couple weeks to Kenya to start this, but really excited to work with colleagues in Kenya to start investigating how are they accounting for stormwater mitigation by way of their urban forest management. How is this articulated in their urban forest management plans? Do they even have plans? And if so, what can we learn from their plans? What can we share with them what we've learned from ours? And how do we kind of move towards, I don't know, just advancing urban forestry across the world? If anyone knows French, we should talk, because I'm not gonna be able to read those plans in Cameroon. So just PSA. All right, so those are the first 2 pillars. My next and final main pillar falls under the extension, the umbrella of extension. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but my position at MSU, my responsibilities are split 3 ways. So about 50% of what I do on the day-to-day basis is research related, 20% is teaching related, the other 30% is extension related, with extension really serving as that bridge between us as researchers to those in the practicing community, making what we learn accessible to help make everyday decisions, like all the more informed by science. So under the extension umbrella falls my 3rd pillar, which is creating accessible pathways to urban forestry careers and education. And there are 3 key initiatives that I'm going to talk about today that have been like closely linked to this particular pillar. First of which is Tree Work 101, getting started in arboriculture. This is a workforce development program that I've been able to lead development of and sort of oversee its operation since 2021 when the program hit the books. But the initiatives really started late 2018, early 2019, right after arriving here at MSU. But overall, the objective of Tree Work 101 is to create a pathway to hands-on technical training in arboriculture. By a show of hands, has anyone ever operated a chainsaw before? Okay. Has anyone ever kind of feared losing a finger or a limb, right? It's a real risk, right? And we're all kind of forces here. So imagine like folks who want to get into the field may have the same fear, but may not necessarily have an accessible pathway to learn how to operate that chainsaw and keep all 10 at the same time. So Tree Work 101 was designed for those folks in mind, thinking about people who may not necessarily want to go the 4-year route or maybe have already done that and want to switch gears and go into arboriculture. This program it's a short course that allows you to get that technical training. We work closely with ISA Michigan chapter and with Dr. Burt Craig. Emily, you were part of those early conversations and getting this up and off the ground. So those early conversations looked like focus groups here on campus, pre-COVID, where we really talked with arborists from across the state, industry leaders, to understand like what do they think the challenges are for getting folks into and then retaining them in the workforce. And we found that there were a lot of concerns around like lack of knowledge of what arboriculture even is and lack of a public or a proper safety culture within the workforce, along with some of the other things that you all can see here. And we use this information from the focus group to really start thinking about, hey, if we build our own program that will meet the needs that have been identified by our local stakeholders here in Michigan, what would that look like? And we moved forward with realizing that if we start with something that's manageable and likely to be of best and most or highest impact, we'd start with a program that would really train up the perfect grounds person. Giving folks what we interpreted, I should say, that giving folks those baseline skills and safely operating the heavy equipment, safely getting off the ground, understanding how to tell a red maple from a sugar maple is going to help them to get their foot in the door and potentially give them an upper leg for actually moving up in their careers. We learned that it should be off the clock training, so a program that's run independently of any one operation, and it should be practical. Information that we provide should be according to industry standard, and it should be a model that could be repeated time and time again. So we took that and we developed Tree Work 101, and it's a program that essentially provides training, hands-on technical, like we spend about maybe an hour in the classroom each day that we meet, and then are outside for another 6 or so hours throughout the day. And we provide basic hands-on training and everything from basic groundwork to rigging to felling and soft skills. Like if you don't want to be in a tree, but you want to run a business, we can help you do that. So through the years, like I said, we've run this, it's kind of like, the top is kind of missing here, but I'll tell you what the top says. So there's a bullet point right on top that essentially shares that we've had 3 cohorts that have been a part of Tree Work 101 over the past 3 years or 3 or so years that we've run it, 21, 23, 24. We've had a total of 27 students who have come through the program, including folks just about to be fresh out of high school to folks who have stepped away from like successful careers in defense law. And then we've had folks who have been signed up and paid for to come and get this training from their well-established municipal employers, such as the City of Ann Arbor, Livonia, Oakland County, and right down the road here in Grand Ledge. I have said we several times now throughout the course, and that is because, again, or not the course, today's little overview, That's because, again, none of this is done independently. Like, there's been a phenomenal team of folks that have worked to make this possible. Like I said, I serve as program director. It could not be done without my industry partners who have become friends, who are also the instructors who do the on-the-ground work of training. We had a standard. Everyone who came in to teach had to be an ISA certified arborist, and they had to have certification from the certified tree safety professionals, or at least in being one. And then again, this has all been made possible through some significant support from Project Green and the DNR. So support included, teaching team included, there's impacts, quantifiable impacts of the program. And so we've learned through pre and post surveys that across 15 different learning outcomes, and I do apologize for the smaller text here, but on average, the percent change in self-reported competency across these areas is an increase of about 64%. So across the board, folks leaving the course felt more confident with respect to operating a chainsaw, identifying different tree species, operating a chipper safely. And it's just really satisfying to know that these efforts, which again were promoted by listening to what the industry wanted, has turned into making real changes on the lives of the individuals who have come through the program. Other programs that I've had an opportunity to lead development of over the past few years include urban wildfire, slightly different target population here, working with graduate and early stage, undergraduate and early stage graduate students from institutions across the US. This program kind of takes a hybrid approach, literally hybrid because COVID forced us into an online space, but also hybrid in that we're not just looking at urban forestry and arboriculture, but also wildland fire, ecology and management, and principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the natural resources workspace. And the whole motivation behind urban wildfire is how do we give folks as many options and as much training as possible to take whatever path in forestry they might want to take after completing their degrees. This was made possible through some support we received from the Forest Service. And then locally here at home, again, it's so weird that the top part is kind of cut off here, but that top line says, oh, it's not that big, but the top line is says Green, oh, there you go, so Green New Deal. Deal standing for, it's nothing political, it's all arts-based, but the Detroit Ecological Arts Leaders Program, honestly, probably one of the biggest joy producers for me since being here at MSU. But this is a collaboration between myself and some colleagues on campus, specifically in the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, and then down the road in Detroit in the University Prep Charter District. And in this particular project, which started 5 years ago, I was invited to create an urban ecology pathway program for University Prep Science and Math High School. And that was a solid foundation, but we realized that yay, urban ecology and urban forestry, but everyone may not feel like yay, right? Or folks may not necessarily connect with being outside, and that's fine. Let's find other pathways to help them connect these concepts. And so we found the arts to be an effective pathway, and that is what birthed the Green New Deal. And so in this particular project, we are utilizing the arts as a tool to help students conceptualize and communicate what they're learning about urban forestry specifically and urban ecology more broadly. We have worked with artists that are Detroit-based, from spoken word artists to visual artists to musicologists, to, again, provide students different ways to get it out, talk about what you're learning. What you see here are some pieces of art that our students have made to visualize the flow of microplastics through the urban forest. And then what you see in these latter two pictures towards the right of the screen are, like, again, a joy producer here, but some of our students that we worked with in Detroit, we were able to bring with us to Costa Rica, where they took those same skills and taught them to students in Costa Rica. And those students in Costa Rica were able to utilize the arts as a means by which to amplify their voices for conservation stewardship and land advocacy in their hometown. So again, grateful to have done that work, and we're continuing that. And I'm looking forward to building on that as I continue to build up my program here. So next step specific to that program, we're currently pursuing a Spencer Foundation grant where we're going to look at the impacts of youth participatory action research and helping to amplify learning outcomes, specifically looking at how do we work with college students to also mentor our high school students. And how does that near-peer mentoring kind of facilitate an even more enriched learning experience? And beyond the K through 12 space, as I look at building up these pathways to successful careers in urban forestry, I'm also now beginning to think not just about workforce development, but once someone has taken the job and maybe get comfortable, how are they effectively retained in the workforce? I recently submitted a paper with some colleagues from the Forest Service and within academia, where we looked at that same question: how do we retain folks effectively in the workspace, looking specifically at women, and have really started to look at what in a post-COVID world are emerging as themes that women want to see in the places that they choose to work in, and what, if they don't see, will likely impact their decision to move on to another location. Time is coming to a close, so I will be relatively brief, wrapping all this up. Additional things that I've done in extension that have been of use within Michigan and beyond include being appointed to the National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council and working with Michigan's version of that council, and then have been able to do a lot of workforce development and inclusion work with the Women's Forest Congress, the U.S. Forest and Wood Products Inclusion Council, and the Green Communities Leadership Institute. I mentioned that I do have a teaching appointment and annually teach our Urban and Community Forestry course, which is offered every spring. And in that class, specifically post-COVID, had to kind of shift, learned really quickly that after 2 years of being spoken to by way of a screen, no one really wanted to just be spoken to in a classroom. So it really forced me to begin implementing more active learning in that space and more experiential learning that connects concepts to real-world communities and real-world decisions. And so over the past few years have worked, again, using the classroom as a base, but now shifting to bringing the students outside and using our campus as a classroom more frequently, as well as communities across the state of Michigan, and then bringing in projects that really allow for these concepts to be connected to like reality, if you will. So over the past 3 years, there's been 3 projects that I've been able to fold into my class that I think have been helpful learning opportunities for our students. And again, have been tied directly to stakeholder identified needs across Michigan. So in 2022, the city of Alma contacted me and asked if we could work together to put together an urban forest management plan for their central business district. I asked if they would mind if my students could be a part of it, and they said no, and so it became the class project that year. And the students who were in the class wrote the current urban forest management plan for Alma's central business district. We did a similar project for East Lansing the following year, where we began to look at the downtown district and did an assessment of the trees that are there, as well as a public assessment of attitudes towards those trees, and then use that to provide the city with a report on ways to consider the future of the urban forest in downtown East Lansing. And just this past school year, I worked with Kevin Sayers and the DNR to modify an old survey that came out of this department in 1981 that looked at a state level assessment of urban forest management practices. The students in this year's class were able to redo that survey, and we're hoping to launch it sometime in the next year. So that's my program in a nutshell. Common theme is it's never done in isolation. I've had a lot of great partners across the community, but also a lot of great students and full-time employees who have come through my lab. And so I just want to highlight the graduate students that have who are currently working with me, including Esther, who's here, Jasmine Brown, Luis Rivera Cubera, who again graduated last fall and now works in the industry. Have had an amazing swath of both graduate and undergraduate students who have come through the lab over the past few years, many of whom are out doing great things in the world, working with our FCCP here, moving on to careers in the DNR, the Forest Service. One's a city forester in Chicago, couldn't be happier for them. Have my 2 full-time folks with David and Sasha on that Detroit-based phytoremediation work. And then I've had the honor of serving on 9 committees between here and other universities in my time here. And so with that, not to be cheesy, but I'm super grateful for all the stuff that's been feasible over the past couple years, and grateful to you all for taking the time to hear about it.
Thank you so much. And we'll take a few questions.
Mine's kind of a two-part question. So you mentioned that when urban areas were developed, that maples and elms were used for decorative growth gas and whatnot. How do you take that into effect when consumers are potentially causing the spread of those diseases?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that's becoming.
Can you repeat?
Yes, yes. So the question was, earlier in the talk, we mentioned how there's been a history of like overplanting of elms and maples. How do we think about that and account for the fact that the general public may be a part of kind of promoting the planting of those species? Does that sound about right?
And like the consumer's energy cutting the tree because of wires and then potentially spreading them.
Yep, and then how does the impact of different management practices such as pruning impact the spread of those diseases? It's a great question. There are certain diseases that are going to spread when you cut and when you cut at a certain time of the year. So here in Michigan, one of the issues that we've been dealing with a lot is oak wilt. And oak wilt is far more likely to spread if you make a cut during the growing season. And to that point, there are very strict rules that consumers have to abide by, that DTE has to abide by, that they cannot do any pruning during the growing season. There's a window from like March to November that they're not allowed to cut in. If they do, there are strict fines that are enforced. So they are not supposed to, and if they do, that's reportable. On the flip side of that, that's a conversation that I've been privy to in the community of foresters to help make that same information available to the broader community. There is an oak wilt coalition that the state runs, led by efforts from like ISA Michigan, and they make that same information available to the general public so that you may not be consumers, but you may have a red oak on your property that looks like it needs to be pruned in May. You can read the Oak Wilt Coalition information to guide you away from making that kind of decision.
Across the state of Michigan, does Detroit serve as the blueprint for how other communities should be participating in urban forestry?
Great question. Slightly political question. So I will say, I won't say Detroit's the blueprint, but I would say that we actually have a lot of really strong models, and then we have cities that have been models at different times like of the past. So right in our backyard, like Lansing, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even into the early 70s was a model city. I wish I could show you, but I have a picture of right outside of Eastern High School in the like late 30s, and just immaculate urban street tree cover. That was a model because the city invested up front. They put a lot of money in. That money went into hiring the best of the best and then training those people once they were here. So much so that folks from Lansing were sought after to go and be urban foresters elsewhere. That was in times past. A more modern city that I think is a great example is Grand Rapids, in part because they have a strong municipal program, but they also work very closely with a local nonprofit. And that really helps to fill the void because there's that base level question, what do we have, right? Trees and resources. Sometimes cities don't have all the resources and they need community partners to help them fill the gaps, to help them connect with people who live down the block. Grand Rapids has done a great job of assessing their own resources and working with the nonprofits that have that community connection and then collectively working together to get things done. And I think Detroit over time has done that really well too, much to the credit of the Greening of Detroit, who's kind of helped to bridge the gap when city resources were low.
I got to skedaddle, but I just want to say great talk, and we're very lucky to have you. And one other thing is that I know a lot of people in forestry in Kenya.
Oh yeah, we got to talk then. Yeah.
Okay. I speak a little Swahili too. Okay.
Yes. One question from the Zoom. It said that when it's about the tree work 101, and when is the next cohort?
It's a great question. So Tree Work 101 has been a grant-supported program since its inception. You may have noticed that the grant totals for that project were like relatively low compared to others and a little bit more short-lived. So we are not yet ready to announce the next cohort because we have to raise the funding to support it. So that's an unfortunate reality of grant-supported programming. So hopefully in the next year, we'll be able to secure additional funds for that and be able to offer it again. Thank you.
I was really interested in learning about how you assess. I was really interested to learn how you assess the needs of the community through both your education and extension programming. And as someone who's just interested in learning more about how you integrated extension and education program, I just had a couple of questions. Like, one is, do you, like, if you want to publish data that you collected on attitudes, do you have to go through like a review for human subjects, and do you collaborate with social scientists for that? And my other question is, like, when you see a mismatch between what a community thinks they need or where they could be better, and like what you think could be better, how do you navigate that mismatch in your education program? Do you have strategies that you use?
Yep. So we had two questions from an audience member. The first question was, oh yeah, when it comes time to like assessing public attitudes and reporting out on that, how do you actually, or what process do you have to get or go through to collect data from the public and report out on it? And then the second question was, when it comes time to working with the community, how do you kind of reconcile you seeing potential solutions from your perspective and then seeing them communicating what they may see as an issue or a potential solution? How do we get on the same page? So for the assessment, was that a good assessment of your questions? Fine enough?
Great.
Okay. So for the first question, yes, we have to go through IRB. So for anything that I plan to publish on, I've had to get the university's internal review board to look at the surveys beforehand and actually okay them or change questions. Part of the reason that I've collaborated with the folks in ARCA, they're great people, but they've also got similarly aligned interests in this like educational YPAR work, but also the training in that area. And so they kind of helped me in navigating those spaces. And then in terms of how do you reconcile the differences between if I think that a particular solution is great and the community thinks if it's another particular solution is great, if I could just step into me, I'm not paid to be anybody's decision maker. So I don't really try to force decisions on folks. I think what I have learned very quickly, especially with like Tree Work 101, I'm not an arborist, right? I didn't know what I was doing when I started there. The only way that I could have done that was by listening. And that's what I found to be the most effective strategy. Like, just listen. And you might have to listen for a long time before you understand where they may be coming from. But also, like, before you develop a report, because you can't just tell somebody to do something and expect that they're going to listen to you. So the strategy that I've been using is just taking time. It's snail's pace and it's very frustrating in a research world, but it's extremely satisfying when you realize research is very important, 50% of an appointment, but life is more than research. And so when you can build those connections with folks, for me, that's when the trust builds and that's when the communications flow and that's when we can both influence each other.